Hello, dear readers. Today we'll talk about why Gantu was eliminated, the underlying reasons behind several controversial changes, and if the ending is truly that bad, or if people are just exaggerating. All that and more in these 30 fun facts about the Lilo and Stitch live-action film. With a moderate budget of $100 million, this movie successfully became an enormous box office hit, reportedly surpassing $1 billion in total worldwide revenue. This achievement is highly commendable for several reasons. Firstly, it substantially exceeded the success of the original animated feature. Moreover, it cemented its place among Disney's most successful live-action remakes, and, at the time of this video, remains the second highest-grossing film of 2025. When the Grand Councilwoman asks Stitch to prove that there is indeed good within him, he responds exactly as in the animated movie, with his famous alien insult, the small difference being that a microphone now emerges from his container. Miga nala quista. For anyone who has ever wondered about the phrase's meaning, there is no official translation, but its creator, Chris Sanders, has repeatedly commented that it is an extremely vulgar insult, so offensive and obscene that merely hearing it is enough to provoke those strong reactions. Therefore, its exact meaning remains a mystery, left entirely to the viewer's imagination. It's worth mentioning that other experiments have also been heard saying those words. Miga nala quista, miga nala quista. Furthermore, in the animated series, that phrase also turns out to be the name of a dangerous virus that infects Jumba's computer, all thanks to Stitch. Unlike her animated counterpart, this version of Mertle does not wear glasses. Additionally, some details change regarding how her fight with Lilo begins. In the original, Mertle simply calls Lilo crazy, which provokes Lilo to violently strike her. But here, Mertle is more overtly cruel from the very first seconds. She tells Lilo she has no friends, mocks Nani for never showing up, and, to top it all off, pushes her aggressively during the presentation. Lilo naturally does not back down, and shoves her back with a tremendous push in front of the other parents. And, speaking of parents, here we actually see Mertle's parents. We never met them in the original animated film. It wasn't until the subsequent animated series and other sequel movies that we were given more information about them.
That's what my dad used to say. I didn't know you had a dad. Quiet, Yuki!
The red spacesuit that Stitch wears is slightly different from the one seen in the animated version. It looks simpler, more like a sort of galactic pajamas, and this time it is visibly marked with his experiment number, 626. It also gives the impression of being less durable, because after crashing on Earth, Stitch is no longer wearing it. This alters the dynamics of the scene with the frog. In the animated version, he took out his blasters and aimed them at Gantu's ship, but that threat is absent here. On the other hand, the moment he is run over is softened somewhat. We no longer see him being brutally flattened by multiple truck wheels. Now, he is only gently rolled over by a single tourist shuttle vehicle. The frog, however, remains present as an unnerving witness to the disaster. If you recall, one of Lilo's pastimes in the animated film was taking photos of tourists, which was actually part of a larger, discarded idea showing how Lilo was viewed by tourists as an exotic animal, as if she were part of an attraction. The prevailing interpretation was that this was Lilo's reason for taking so many photos, a way of inverting the gaze, treating the tourists as if they were the animals. Of course, since this entire subplot was cut from the original, that interpretation for the photos was also discarded, and the background reason for her taking them was simply that she likes it, without much depth. Some fans who knew about this deleted idea hoped this live-action film would rescue some of that concept, but it didn't. It seems, in fact, to have been censored even further, as Lilo isn't even seen taking photographs. The moment Lilo adopts Stitch features a few notable differences. The most significant is that this time, Nani does not accompany Lilo to the shelter. Instead, it's Tūtū, the neighbor, who helps Lilo adopt the puppy without Nani's direct permission. This is the film's way of showing us how close the neighbor has become to the Pleakley family, so much so that she is essentially like a grandmother to Lilo. In fact, her name reflects this. In Hawaiian, Tūtū is a term of endearment for grandmother. Chris Sanders, one of the original film's directors, and also the iconic voice of Stitch, returns for this live-action film to voice the mischievous experiment once more, although he does not return as director. That task fell to Dean Fleischerkamp, a filmmaker who had not previously worked with Disney or on any other major blockbuster, but who gained widespread acclaim thanks to his independent film, Marcel the Shell, with Shoes On, a critically acclaimed feature that won him an Annie Award and even earned him an Oscar nomination, though the winner in that category was Pinocchio by Guillermo del Toro. In the animated film, it was never explicitly explained how Jumba and Pleakley knew exactly that Stitch was located in an animal shelter. It was simply assumed they tracked him. Here, however, they sought to provide a small justification. Since this movie is set in the present day, virtually everyone has camera phones. And the mischievous Stitch happens to interrupt none other than a wedding, where everyone takes advantage of the situation to snap photos and videos of him. This footage, of course, ends up on the local news, which is precisely how Jumba and Pleakley figure out that Stitch was taken to a shelter. In one of the scenes, when Cobra Bubbles is shown an email from the animal shelter where Stitch was adopted, a curious detail appears. The adoption date was June 26th, which is known in real life as World Stitch Day, since June 26th is written as 626, perfectly matching his experiment number. Returning to Cobra, if you recall, in the animated version he was initially introduced as a social worker, but he is eventually revealed to have been in the CIA. In this live-action version, however, he is only a CIA agent, although he does pretend to be a social worker to get closer to Stitch, which allows the film to recreate this memorable moment from the animated version. Pleakley is played by actor Billy Magnuson, whom we had previously seen in another Disney live-action remake, Aladdin, where he played Prince Anders Jumba. For his part, is played by Zach Galifianakis, whom some will recognize from the Hangover films. The actor himself confessed that he did not know much about the animated version. Even his children hadn't seen it, so he was genuinely unfamiliar with Jumba and simply followed the director's instructions. Furthermore, he couldn't even shine in what he does best, comedy, because due to the Writers Guild strike occurring at the time, actors were not permitted to improvise, forcing him to strictly adhere to the script. One of the most fondly remembered running gags from the original film and the series was that of the sunburnt, overweight man who could never manage to eat his ice cream. Something always happened that caused him to drop it. He also appears in this live-action version, although he's not quite as similar to his animated counterpart, as here he is not a tourist, but a native of Hawaii, and this time, instead of ice cream, he is about to enjoy a Hawaiian shaved ice. Regarding this fact, there is some sad news. It was announced that this actor passed away only 3 weeks after the movie's premiere. If you remember, in the animated film there was a moment when Stitch, to satisfy his destructive urges, begins to destroy a miniature city in a Godzilla-like fashion. And in this live-action film, that moment is recreated, but with sandcastles. And speaking of the beach, everything was real. The director proudly states that 100% of the film was shot in Hawaii. He was determined to capture its beautiful, authentic landscapes. However, for slightly boring logistical reasons, they could not film on the island of Kauai, where the original film was set, so they did so on the island of Oahu instead. Several of the original voice actors returned for this live-action film in new roles. For example, Tia Carrere, the original voice of Nani, now plays the new character of the social worker. Tūtū, for her part, is played by Amy Hill, who was the voice of Mrs. Hasagawa in the original, although sadly, that character does not appear in this new version. The manager of the Luau where Nani works does appear, played by Jason Scott Lee, who voiced David in the animated version. And, as an extra fact, this actor also participated in the live-action Mulan, where he played the villain. Although Stitch's design was already defined by his animated version, the director was inspired by real elements of nature to give a more authentic touch to certain features of the character. In the making of, for example, they shared that his ears are based on those of a deer, his nose resembles that of a bulldog, his eyes look similar to those of a koala, and his quick movements are inspired by those of a squirrel. On the other hand, it must also be said that he has some slight differences that contrast with his animated version. For instance, here Stitch's nose is black, while in his classic version it was dark blue. Furthermore, due to the attempt at realism, we see a much greater difference in size between Lilo and Stitch, whereas in the animated version, they were nearly the same height. Now then, beyond the design, one of the greatest challenges in working on productions of this style is how to make the actors interact naturally with computer-generated creatures. To facilitate this crucial process, several full-furred Stitch puppets were built. This allowed the young actress to have something physical and tangible to bond with, and at the same time served as a visual guide for the effects team. Although, of course, that did not prevent some curious mistakes or scenes that turned out a little strange. A very peculiar example is when Lilo points to her new dog. She theoretically has him right next to her, but for some reason, she seems to be pointing toward the floor. The funniest thing is that the visual effects team seemed to try to disguise it by making Stitch look to the side, as if Lilo were referring to another puppy. In the animated version, Nani loses her job at the Luau because Stitch bites Pleakley's head, and the manager scolds her upon seeing that her dog had harmed a customer. But it seems that scene was too cartoonish for this live-action film. as it was replaced by a different event, Stitch imitating the fire dance and causing a major fire, a disaster large enough to properly justify Nani's dismissal. Furthermore, it must be mentioned that the way Nani takes that dismissal is also different. In the animated film, she acts like she doesn't care. She even jokes with Lilo so she won't worry, while in the live action, the tone is much more serious, and Nani's frustration is very palpable. In the animated version, there was a moment where Nani's room was shown to have several surfing medals and trophies, but this was never truly explored in depth. Here, however, Nani's achievements gain more weight. There is even a moment when Lilo shows a photo of Nani carrying a large rock at the bottom of the sea, which works as a foreshadowing of the strength and ability she would later demonstrate to save Stitch. Elvis Presley was a good citizen. Unlike the animated version, here Elvis is not highlighted as a model citizen, but that does not mean his music is absent. You simply cannot make a Lilo and Stitch movie without including the king. That's why this live-action film also features several of his songs, in addition to a new version of Burning Love, produced by Bruno Mars and performed by his nephews. And just as the original film did in its time, this live-action film also incorporates the voices of the children's choir from the Kamehameha schools in Hawaii. The director of the choir, in fact, was the same person from 22 years ago, who also happens to be the mother of Chris Bright, one of the screenwriters for this live-action film. In both the original film and the series, we saw Jumba and Pleakley use disguises to look more human, which were not at all convincing, but somehow, no one seemed to realize they were aliens. Something that worked within the logic of animation, however. In a more realistic version, it might seem highly unbelievable. So here they simply alter their appearance with a device, thus managing to go unnoticed. Of course, this change meant the loss of one of Pleakley's most amusing traits, his theatrical personality and his strong desire to cross-dress, using dresses, wigs, and makeup. Something that was virtually eliminated from this version. And speaking of lost elements, Jumba's accent must also be mentioned. Regardless of whether you listen to him in his original language or with the dubbing, Jumba stood out for his particular Eastern European/Slavic-inspired accent.
626 cannot be taught to ignore its destructive programming.
However, the Jumba of this remake does not speak that way.
Built to destroy 626 and you...
The actor did not explain exactly why they chose not to include the accent, but he hinted at some factors. Perhaps he couldn't pull off the accent, or that they wanted to avoid something that could potentially be deemed offensive. In this version, we see Nani manage to get a job as a surf instructor, something that never happened in the original film. The closest she came was when she tried to get a job as a beach lifeguard, but at that moment, she was affected by the disaster Stitch caused after tourists began taking photos of him while he was wearing the Elvis costume, a disguise which, incidentally, only appears here for a brief moment during the film's ending. In this adaptation, when it's time to surf, Stitch is given flotation devices. So here Jumba and Pleakley must first deflate them to sink him. Furthermore, here they are no longer swimming among the waves as in the animated film, but doing so using jet skis. But the biggest difference comes afterward. Following this incident, Lilo is sent to the hospital, and that is precisely the way they force Nani to renounce her custody, so that the state can take over Lilo's medical expenses. One of the major absences in this live-action film was the entire metaphor of the ugly duckling. In the animated film, Lilo explained the story to Stitch, and with this, he understood the concept of family. It was an important part of his development, but on this occasion, sadly, it was lost. Therefore, that moment where Stitch feels alone and questions his purpose is no longer shown in the same manner. The closest we get here is when Stitch sadly moves away from the house and encounters the frog he saw upon arriving on Earth, which is revealed to have its own family. This is an addition of the live action, as in the animated film, it was just a solitary frog. In the original film, we never saw Nani driving, despite the fact that she did own a vehicle, a Volkswagen Beetle. That's where the famous punch buggy moment comes from. Unfortunately, that specific scene is not recreated in this live-action film. This is because Nani no longer has a Volkswagen, but a pickup truck, which she uses in several scenes, and which, in fact, ends up being very important near the ending. In this live-action film, Jumba is crueler. We know his animated version often proclaimed himself an evil genius, but his attempt at villainy was ultimately more adorable. Let's say he wasn't as bad as he thought, and in the end, he proved to have a good heart by helping to rescue Lilo. However, this Jumba is genuinely cruel. He shows a clear contempt for human life and for any type of emotional connection. He even intentionally destroys Lilo's house and her personal belongings, something he didn't exactly do in the original. As the house's destruction, there was more collateral damage from his confrontation with Stitch. In the animated series, in the episode where Pleakley's family visits him, it was revealed that his real name was Wendy, a name he apparently never liked. He was always ashamed of his name, and in this live action, that name is referenced, only it seems that this Pleakley changed it to a more masculine version. In the climax, Stitch refers to himself again as fluffy and cute. The difference is that, in the animated film, Stitch said it to Gantu.
Vile, you're foul, you're smart!
Oh, so cute and fluffy!
Whereas here, he says it to Jumba. You're a terrifying and dangerous monster. Also fluffy and cute. The ironic thing is that, according to the animated sequel, those were the very first words Stitch ever heard from his creator.
So fluffy, even.
Where did I go wrong?
And speaking of creations, this live-action film does something its animated version never did. It visually references other experiments. There is a moment where holograms of Angel, Reuben, and 627 can be seen. As you may recall, Angel is Stitch's love interest. Reuben is that adorable experiment who worked with Gantu in the animated series and was constantly preparing sandwiches. And 627 was the experiment Jumba created in the series when Stitch became very arrogant, believing himself to be the best, which led Jumba to want to create another experiment, an improved and much more evil version that would challenge Stitch. One of the biggest complaints about this live-action film was the absence of Gantu, who was the final antagonist in the animated version. It was believed that he was simply eliminated due to budget constraints, but the reality seems to be different. It was revealed that Gantu was in the early versions of the script, but the director chose not to include him. This is because he believed that, in the original film, Gantu lacked a personal connection to the protagonists. That is, there was no genuinely antagonistic reason to justify his participation. In a way, he was just doing his job. That's why he felt Gantu had no place in this live action, and his antagonistic role was passed to Jumba, who does have a closer connection to his creation, which the director felt added greater dramatic force to the story. Of course, this change also altered the outcome. In the animated version, when Gantu has Lilo kidnapped, Stitch asks Jumba for help. In the live action, however, since that situation never occurs, Jumba does not manage to integrate into the family and ends up remaining solely as the villain, who is defeated at the end. During filming, young Maya Kealoha, who plays Lilo, was right at the stage where children begin to lose their baby teeth, so they had to make her a small dental prosthesis. And speaking of behind-the-scenes anecdotes, for the scene where Stitch has supposedly died, the director was convinced it would be one of the most difficult to film, thinking it would take about 100 takes to get the right one. But the opposite happened. Maya managed to genuinely cry on the very first take, snot and all. When the director asked her how she managed to get so emotional, she replied that she simply imagined that by dying, Stitch would get to meet Lilo's parents. Thanks to that powerful mental image, the little girl managed to deliver a moving performance. This moment, incidentally, is very reminiscent of the ending of Lilo and Stitch 2, where they also make us believe he is gone forever. In the end, the original film revealed that the Grand Councilwoman already knew Cobra from a certain incident. He even told Nani that he had once saved the Earth, convincing the aliens that mosquitoes were an endangered species. It was an ingenious joke that connected with what Pleakley had said at the beginning of the movie. And that species, remember, is endangered. And yes, in this live action, Pleakley mentions it again. The difference is that this time, it is never explained how that information reached the aliens, because Cobra does not mention it. Furthermore, it seems that in this version, he and the Grand Councilwoman did not know each other, although he does give her a strange flirtatious look that leaves room for suspicion. Now let's talk about the controversial ending. To understand it, we must first focus on Nani and the creative vision they had for her. You see, for the director, the Nani of the animated version always seemed to be sacrificing her dreams without ever questioning anything. That's why this live-action film attempts to give the character more depth, by showing these moments where we see more of her frustration and all the sacrifices she has made for Lilo's well-being. We discover that she was a bright student and a great surfer, with a desire to study marine biology, but that due to her complicated situation, she has had to renounce all of that. With this version, they wanted Nani to be able to pursue her ambitions without failing to ensure her sister's well-being. And this is where one of the new messages this live-action film attempts to convey comes in, which has to do with the term hanai, a Hawaiian cultural practice that refers to informal adoption. It is a custom that strengthens community ties and involves caring for a child when the biological parents cannot, or simply to alleviate some of the burden of raising them. And the movie uses it to remind us of something important. We are not alone. Many times we feel like the world is crashing down on us, and we have to carry all that weight, but that is not always the case. A support network exists, be it friends or close family, and accepting that help is not wrong. So, although to some it may seem that Nani is abandoning Lilo, the director defends his decision by saying that was not the case, since this concept of Hanai allows Lilo to essentially live in the same place and with people she already loves. And Lilo herself is the one who encourages Nani to fulfill her dream, to take advantage of her full scholarship in California and study what she is so passionate about. For the director, the idea of Ohana is not just about keeping everyone physically together, but about supporting each other, even if that means making difficult choices. And this new ending seeks to honor that spirit by demonstrating that Nani's aspirations are also valid and deserve to be realized. That's why the incorporation of Tūtū was key, so that she would be the one to take Lilo in at the end. Nani is not leaving her with a stranger, but with someone who is like family. And the best part is that, thanks to alien technology, she can visit Lilo with ease. So, in reality, the sisters are not that separated. Even so, the director understands that there will be people dissatisfied for one reason or another, but he also maintains that the idea was never to copy the original, but to propose something different that could resonate with other people, offering an honest story about what it means to lose everything and, even so, find a way to move forward thanks to having a support network and an alien weapon that opens portals. Anyone can do it that way. Just imagine what you save on transportation. Despite the complaints about the changes made, the film received mostly positive reviews. And as expected, following its enormous box office success, Disney quickly announced a sequel. With the theme of the experiments, this franchise genuinely has a lot left to explore. It is basically Disney's Pokémon universe. Now, it is still unclear whether they will directly adapt the animated sequel, or if they will use the movie that served as the pilot for the animated series as a basis, where characters like Ruben, Sparky, and other experiments were introduced. Perhaps they will end up doing a combination of both, mixed with some ideas from the series. In any case, the good news is that Chris Sanders will be part of the screenwriting team, and that, undoubtedly, is a guarantee of greater fidelity and respect for the original material. I would expect them to finally redeem Jumba now, but hey, we'll see how it turns out. Meanwhile, let me know your honest opinion on this live-action film.